As is often the case, the original script for what became Alien Covenant was a different beast to what ended up on screen. Jack Paglen and Michael Green worked on drafts that were more of a continuation of Prometheus and gave Dr. Elizabeth Shaw a more prominent role. Artist Carlos Huante spoke to HN Entertainment about David as an allegory for the devil, with creatures like Bug and a kind of meerkat creature as his Nephilim. However, the basic story of David destroying the engineers and a colony crew stumbling across them appears to have been more or less in place since inception. While scripts were being written and concept art being produced, production was pushed back a year due to Michael Fassbender's commitments, and it is believed that Shaw's role was downgraded at the direction of the studio. A 10-minute prologue revealing Shaw's fate was written, but this was ultimately reduced to a 2.5-minute sequence called The Crossing, released separately to the film. The end of The Crossing leads to a 90-second sequence of David releasing the pathogen on the engineers as seen in the final film. Although the film has writing credits shared between Paglen, Green, Dante Harper and John Logan, the drafts we'll be looking at bear sole screenwriting credit to John Logan. Harper has spoken about writing the flute scene, which is absent from both these drafts, so it's possible he worked on the film further after Logan prior to shooting commencing in April 2016. The dates on the drafts are August 19, 2015 and November 20, 2015. The prologue is dated August 8 and is absent from the August 19 draft, seemingly dropped in the intervening week or so. It gives a fairly detailed account of what happened after Shaw and David left LV-223, how Shaw leaves David outside for her own safety, how he convinces her to let him back in, her rewiring him, the bond they form, and then how he murders her just as they arrive at the engineer homeworld. It tends to feel a little cheap and too much of a hand-washing of the previous film, so it can be forgotten about and we can move on. It's not dissimilar to the unpopular start of Alien 3 that knocked off Hicks and Newt. It also sets up David as the villain right from the outset, rather than attempting any ambiguity or teasing out what happened to Shaw. In the final film, we're still not entirely certain what happened to her. Both scripts feature many scenes that are word-for-word identical to each other, so we'll use the August script as a starting point and compare what got changed to the November script and ultimately the final film. Notably absent is the film's opening scene with Peter Wayland and the birth of David. That scene adds a new dimension to David and his relationship with both his creator and humanity in general, more of which is revealed later on. The extended version of this scene appears on the Blu-ray release, where David provides more detail about Das Rheingold and the entry of the gods into Valhalla. This portion was wisely excised from the scene, as it too closely telegraphs the film to follow. Both scripts, the August draft called Paradise Lost and the November draft called Alien Covenant, open with the birth of a star and the neutrino burst we encounter a little while later. The Covenant zips along at super light speeds nearby. Stars are described as distorting around the ship in a similar fashion to the red and blue shift described in the original script for Alien. In the final film, as in the final film of Alien, no visual attempt is made to show us how faster-than-light travel works. Both drafts give the same legend for the ship, which is slightly different from the film. The date is noted to be 2103 instead of the more precise December 5, 2104 from the film. Both also mention 14 crew plus 1 synthetic, despite only having 13 crew plus 1 synthetic. Even at this fairly late stage, Rosenthal is not present in the script, thus making the scripted legend incorrect. Rosenthal, being a late addition to the film, is reflected in Alan Dean Foster's prequel novel Origins, where Rosenthal is the last person recruited to the Covenant a couple of weeks prior to launch. The basic makeup of the ship is described with a bit more detail in the November draft. We see the nursery, which houses the thousands of colonists in hypersleep, a gentle snow falling. Mother completes a count of the colonists. This is changed in the November script to a time call. The next major change is Walter tending to a greenhouse and bantering with Mother. This was in the August script and ended up being shot but ultimately deleted. The November script changes the setting to a vertical garden in the main crew wardroom, much like the meal area on the Nostromo or Prometheus. No such wardroom ended up in the film, and we only saw people eat in their own quarters. The banter here also seems a little out of place. Computers in the Alien universe are very straightforward and matter-of-fact, not given to discussion. Walter also calling Mother a bitch seems out of character for him. Walter makes a point of talking about duty as a counterpoint to David saying Walter acts out of love, not doing things because he wants to, it's just duty. Resisting this duty to the point of calling Mother a bitch doesn't really fit his personality, nor does him swearing. In what would have been a more visually spectacular scene, the Covenant drops to sublight speed to recharge while orbiting an ice giant planet. Walter witnesses an exploding nebula and a neutrino wave washes through the star system and over the planet and the ship. At this point in the August script, we're introduced to Griffin, who would be renamed Daniels in the November script and film. Griffin, named for an amalgam of eagle and lion, the strongest of birds and beasts, is much the same in both scripts in terms of her personality, and this is mirrored in the final film. The name is perhaps a little on the nose, while Daniels is a little more subtle. Her husband, Jacob in the November script and film, is named Adam in the August script. Also a bit on the nose, considering he's leading people to a new world. Mind you, the biblical Jacob stole his brother's birthright, and as Oram is a religious man, he may see himself as Esau when he was passed over for command of the Covenant. Speaking of Oram, he isn't the religious man he is in the film at this point, and he's also named Bill rather than Chris. And he's a bit sweary, and in one draft is described as being commanding with a greying beard. Tennessee and Griffin/Daniels try to get Adam/Jacob's cryotube open, while Oram tries to work the controls, and Lope eventually steps in with an axe, to no avail. Walter runs into the nursery to find a bunch of wrecked cryotubes. In the aftermath, the crew shower and we're introduced to Ferris, Rix and Upworth. They observe a drifting sail outside and talk about what they can fix and what they can't, noting Griffin and Adam's suits hanging on a hook with a note that says, "We made it." In the August draft, Adam's surname is Jacobson. By November, the final name of Branson is in place. The crew gather in the galley/wardroom and we're reintroduced to the main players: Oram, Kareen, Tennessee, Ferris, Lope, and his partner Hallett. Ferris is described as wearing a cowboy hat, which was eventually given to Tennessee as Ridley Scott wanted Danny McBride to do a take on Slim Pickens from Dr. Strangelove. The biggest major difference here is Oram. In the final film, Oram is, as I mentioned, quite religious and uses his faith to make up for his lack of confidence and charisma. In the August version, he is uncomfortable being addressed as captain, but the November version has him demanding to be addressed as captain when Hallett apologises for being late. Conversely, when the crew, including Kareen, start to push for a funeral for the former captain, he relents. In the November version, he dismisses the crew at the end of the meeting and they give each other a sceptical look. Also in that draft, he effectively grounds Danny by taking her off the work roster so she can quote-unquote cry it out, which is similar to the deleted scene available on Blu-ray. In the earlier draft, Oram's approach is softer, but she says she'd rather work. In the final film, Billy Crudup plays a bit of a mix of both versions, pushing when he has to about the urgency of the repairs, but not sweating stuff like rank and titles. Next we jump straight to Tennessee outside doing repairs, on his own rather than with Angkor. He asks about Griffin and she responds that she's fine. She and Walter are in the terraforming bay, which sets up Chekhov's tillers, low-yield warheads for flattening the ground, which come into play later on. As Daniels is confined to quarters, Tennessee doesn't refer to her in the November draft, and the scene with Walter is omitted. Both drafts have a scene of Cole and Ledwood packing up dead colonist bodies, and through tiredness accidentally drop one. Oram snaps at them about respect for the dead, which further puts him offside with the crew. The November draft has Kareen trying to get him to chill out a bit. In the August script, Griffin sobs in the communal showers as Lope and Hallett enter, then leave to give her some privacy. Then Rix and Upworth ask if she wants company, which she declines. Both of these scenes are omitted from the November draft and we skip straight to Danny packing away her husband's things in her room. It's easy to see why the scenes were cut, as Danny mourning in her room condenses things and has less repetition. After packing Adam's things away, Griffin radios Walter. The scene is longer in the November version where Walter turns up unbidden with 3 joints in order to help her relax. He suggests that she returns to work. This scene also helps set up a more intimate relationship between Daniels and Walter. Walter suggests that he's merely following his programming to try and help Daniels, but she believes it's not that simple. This extended scene was included on the Blu-ray, minus the last 2 lines where Daniels says she's been taken off the duty roster, and Walter says Oram doesn't need to know. The November draft next features a similar scene to the earlier one where Griffin and Walter were in the terraforming bay. However, this version makes the first reference to the cabin on the lake, and no mention is made of the Tiller missiles. This scene leads directly into the funeral scene. When Griffin radios Walter from her room in the August draft, that then leads to the same scene. The funeral is slightly different in that Tennessee and Farris and the toast are absent from the August version. Griffin plays Nat King Cole's Unforgettable as she launches his body into space. Earlier in that scene is another intimate exchange between woman and android, as Walter asks why she wanted him to accompany her, and she talks about how the crew is made up of couples and he would know what it's like to be alone. As Oram hadn't specifically forbidden the service for the captain earlier, there's no intercutting of him fuming on the bridge as we see in the film. The scene where they intercept Shaw's transmission is quite different. The August draft has T finishing repairs and the ship powering up and Rick's picking up the signal. It's a group effort in deciphering it, with Griffin, Walter, Ricks and Upworth all chipping in to get the hell-spawned audio listenable. Shaw appears as a life-size hologram talking about paradise, not knowing if it will be heaven or hell. She talks about loneliness, whether she's going to meet gods, and asking for others to follow. Loneliness is more of a theme in this draft than ultimately what ended up in the film. Ricks pinpoints the source of the transmission and Oram says they're going to check it out, to the crew's delight. Tennessee enters, having missed all this, and asks what's going on. In another area, Oram looks at a diorama of their planned colony and Griffin questions his course of action. Oram is quite genial and says ultimately it will be her call as chief terraformist. The November draft plays it out this sequence closer to the film, with Tennessee picking up the hologram in his suit, then playing it back to the crew inside. This scene features the only link to Oram's faith in the final film, where he talks about being raised Pentecostal and speaking in tongues while they translate Shaw's transmission. This transmission is very different. She talks about mountains of dead and pleads for help, then offers the Catholic Requiem prayer. This is a little at odds with the Shaw at the end of Prometheus, when she warns any passing ships to stay well away from LV-223. The planet is found and they set course. In this draft, Oram and Daniels speak privately on the bridge, and Oram gets too personal for Daniels, mentioning that she and Branson wanted to raise a family on Origai 6. She raises her voice to object. Others notice, and Oram tells her not to question her judgment on his bridge. Later in this draft, Danny is smoking a joint in bed when they jump to light speed, and she lifts the needle off the record she's listening to so it doesn't get scratched. In the August draft, Walter brings her the joints just prior to this, similar to the earlier scene in the November draft, but lacking the more personal moments. Both scripts are almost the same for the next few scenes. They drop to sublight speed and go into orbit around the planet. Ricks talks about a thick ionosphere being like a big warm blanket, letting good stuff in and bad things out, unaware of the forthcoming irony. The August draft has Oram requesting Griffin's permission to deploy to the surface, which she grants. This is absent from the November draft. They board the lander and head to the surface. Corrine says, "I hate space" at one point, which was eventually given to Hallett. The lander completely loses power during descent, terrifying all involved until they get lower and the engines flare back to life. After landing in the August draft, a suited bio team goes outside to test the atmosphere before they depart. The November draft has Walter going out on his own to check, ironically quoting Neil Armstrong as he steps off the ramp. Again, both scripts are much the same as they trek to the signal source, with the only real difference being Lope pulling out a state-of-the-art bow and arrow in the November draft. Another difference is that they find animal life. A salamander surprises Hallett when it runs over his boot. Of course, the final film has Daniels commenting that it's completely silent with no animals. Once they reach a high plane, they talk about setting up right there. The August draft has Oram saying they could set the Covenant down right on that spot, and Griffin and Ricks should think of a name for the planet. November has a slightly different take, with Walter saying it would be a good place for a log cabin. It also extends the scene from the August draft and has them finding wheat, and Lope revealing that he's from Iowa, so he knows wheat. Ledwood's infection scene has a couple of differences. Rather than the motes coming from the small fungus-like growths in the film, The stream is swarming with tiny midge-like insects. In the August draft, they actually infect Kareen first, flying up her nose and inserting a tube into her skin. Ledwood finds a dead mammal infested with white grubs. One of the midges inserts a tube into his neck. In the November draft, Kareen unwittingly avoids a swarm of midges lunging for her when Ledwood calls her about the dead animal. Ledwood himself has a tiny insect fly into his ear to infect him, similar to the film. Both scripts play out the same as they find the Dreadnought and find a way in through the bomb bay. They find broken urns and small prototype alien eggs, not human-sized, covered with black mould. Hallett lags behind, studying them. In the August draft, a tendril of mould darts out and stings him when he gets too close. In the November draft, one of the small eggs actually opens. Hallett thinks better of it and backs away, stepping on another egg which emits a cloud of midges. One flies up his nose, much as it does in the final film. Inside the ship, they find the navigation chamber with an empty chair and sleep pods. Walter activates a flashing light on the command panel, and Shaw's hologram appears, repeating the transmission they intercepted. The August draft has Griffin, Lope and Walter finding Shaw's things, including her crucifix in a nearby room, along with some other personal effects. This is condensed in the November draft to having them find her things in the navigation chamber itself. Walter reacts visibly to seeing the Wayland Industries logo on Shaw's helmet. Using the crucifix here was a nice tie-back to Prometheus, and her retrieving it from David towards the end of that film. Covenant ultimately used dog tags, which lack any connection to Prometheus, as she never wore dog tags. Absent from the November draft is a scene outside with Cole and Anchor, as the mist clears and they find thousands of broken urns and dead engineer bodies. Both scripts then cut to Kareen and Ledwood, as the latter doubles over, struggling to breathe, with the later script having blood seeping from his pores. The earlier script now sees the crew on the mountainside with the engineer graveyard. Many of the bones are pitted with irregular holes. Griffin recommends they evacuate, and Oram wholeheartedly agrees. As they head down, Walter explains some backstory of the Prometheus mission and Peter Wayland to Griffin, while Hallett starts to struggle. Walter does this exposition bit in the November scripts while they're still on the Dreadnought, just as Oram interrupts to say they have to leave for a medical emergency. In the November script, Faris briefly talks to T on the Covenant. This is missing from the August script, as Faris talks to Oram, saying Kareen and Ledwood are back and Ledwood seems to be sick. The start of the medbay scene is similar in both drafts, with Faris being more panicky in the latter draft, shouting at Kareen to stop contaminating everything. Faris takes Ledwood's shirt off, revealing his skin stretching around his back and organic worms knitting a lattice together, along with regular pockmarks in his neck, which is revolting. As far as is known, no concept art was done for this version, at least by Dane Hallett or Matt Hatton. Kareen tries to calm Ledwood as Faris exits to contact Oram, locking the door. In the August draft, Faris also notices pockmarks on Kareen's arm. Faris radios Oram and he says they're an hour out in one draft and that they're close in the other. Faris then talks to the Covenant, but the signal breaks up and both scripts spend a couple of minutes of Tennessee, Upworth and Ricks working out how to get a better signal. They settle into a lower orbit, briefly talk to Faris, then the whole ship loses power, similar to what happened to the lander. This sequence is a little hit and miss. Cutting away to a debate on the Covenant Bridge is a distraction from what's happening in the medbay. But on the other hand, the result of that debate also puts them in jeopardy, meaning now everyone is in it up to their necks. As things stand, T-Rex and Upworth aren't in any real danger for most of the film. A big deal is made of descending to a lower orbit, but while they're knocked around a bit, they stay there for a number of hours while the cargo lift is prepped and launched, and damage to the ship is minimal. Faris is called back to medbay by Kareen. The August script sees Ledwood lying still on the medlab bed, with crusty welted holes on his face, and Kareen's botched attempts to remove the wormy lattice. Kareen wants out, but Faris won't open the door. Then the skin parts on Kareen's face, revealing her own nasty wormy crochet. Faris tries to raise the Covenant to tell them they're going to need quarantine when they get back, but can't reach them. The November version lacks Kareen's infection, and Ledwood is hunched on the examination table, his back to us. Back on the Covenant, they still have no power. Rix rushes off to the nursery to check the sleeping colonists when the artificial gravity cuts out. Outside in the forest, the expedition near the lander when Hallett collapses. In the med lab, both scripts describe the birth of the Neomorph from Leadwood much the same, and it's much the same as what ends up on screen. Spikes bursting out of his back, followed by the creature itself, which quickly starts to grow and attacks Kareen. In the August draft, the sequence runs up to the creature killing Kareen, then smashing the door down to get to Faris, who is outside. In the November draft, we cut away to Faris running through the ship, radioing the expedition team who are almost back, then getting a gun from the weapons locker. She heads back inside the med bay, but accidentally has the safety catch on the gun, and the creature attacks her. She barely escapes. The Neomorph smashes the door open, shots fired in the lift bay, and the lander explodes. The August draft doesn't have Faris going back to med lab. She radios the away team, gets a gun, shots fired, and outside in the forest, they see the explosion and Hallett's Neomorph births. This scene has a number of differences. In the August draft, the Neomorph orbit obliterates Hallett's head, its own pointed head distended from the host's. The pointed head here sounds more like the deacon from the end of Prometheus. In the November version, it's more like the film, with Hallett vomiting up a placenta-like sac from which the Neomorph emerges. In both versions, the Neomorph knocks over some of the crew and climbs into the trees. Cole is sent flying by a tentacle before it drops on Anchor and disembowels him. Leadwood's Neomorph joins the party, and there's lots of gunfire strobing through the now darkened forest, none particularly effective. Lope fires an explosive arrow but misses and hits a tree. Walter has his hand bitten off, and David shows up, scaring the Neomorphs away and telling them he's here to serve. Lope farewells the dead Hallett, even kissing him in the November draft, which Rosenthal wisely warned him off doing in the film. The other main difference in this scene is that Oram is distraught in the November draft. He sees Faris coming down the ramp burning and imagines his wife suffering the same fate. This is absent from the August draft, where they just go with David and barely a word is said about 3 more dead crewmates. Both drafts now cut to the Covenant drifting without power. Rix notices that the ice in the nursery is melting off the colonists' pods, which isn't really how hypersleep works. A room doesn't need to be freezing for it to work. However, this is just another layer of jeopardy for the Covenant crew, which, as we mentioned earlier, isn't really present in the film. The August draft has Tennessee trying to contact the ground via a battery connected to the radio in the cargo lift. He and Upworth wear ice suits. Rix floats in the zero gravity with an idea. The November draft cuts this scene and cuts straight to the idea. Rix explains in one draft and Upworth in the other that they could rig up a recharge sail tied directly into the engines to give them enough power to escape the field that they're stuck in. T is sceptical, saying it might fry the engines, but they're running out of time. Their orbit is decaying, and the sleep pods are starting to fail. On the ground, the next few scenes feature much the same events and impart the same information, but in a slightly different order. David leads the survivors up a hill, through a killing ground of dead, mutilated engineers. He explains about the energy field that has put the planet in quarantine to stop the contagion. If the lander had taken off, they'd lose power trying to pass through the field and crash. Shaw was killed in the crash when they arrived 10 years earlier. The pathogen wiped the engineer civilization out in days. They arrive at the top of a hill overlooking the engineer city. They walk through the city to a cathedral that David says is safe. David and Walter speak privately about Wayland. Walter says he is Model 217. David says he's number 1, and Walter looks at him with a kind of admiration. The August draft next has them talking about the colonisation mission, which is pushed back to a later scene in the November draft. David also says everyone on the lander is dead in the August draft, and Oram asks Griffin if she really thinks they are. This clunky exchange was mercifully omitted from the November draft. As mentioned earlier, it makes no sense that Oram would just leave Kareen behind if he wasn't sure. Also in this draft, the city is described as looking like it was designed by H.R. Giger, and what might be a launch silo is mentioned, but then never mentioned again. The large hole in the middle of the city, which contains engineer ships, as seen in a deleted scene, may be a hint to this. The launch silo is omitted from the November draft, and the hole with the ships that was ultimately deleted from the film makes little sense when the final film has no field stopping David from leaving in one of the ships of his own accord. The November draft also features a flashback to the Dreadnought arriving but lacks any detail. We're not explicitly told that David deployed the pathogen, though him reciting Revelation chapter 6 verse 8 is a pretty big hint. David complains about the filth in the cathedral, which Walter smiles at. The August draft has David leading Lope and Cole up to the roof to set up a radio, and Griffin, Oram and Walter discussing what they think about David. Oram doesn't trust him. Looking at David's elaborate art that hangs everywhere, Griffin asks Walter if he can create like that. Walter says that he cannot, and Griffin says that if David can create, he can lie. Oram tells Walter to see what he can find out, and Walter comes close to taking offence, asking if the captain would be so distrustful if David were human. A very similar scene occurs a few pages later in the November draft, after David has hosted a meal, and they speak about the colonisation mission, and David makes some sarcastic remarks about colonialism. While David speaks with Cole, Lope is included in the conversation and is even more suspicious than the others, pushing Oram by reminding him that half the crew, including Hallett and Kareen, are dead, and he wants to know why. After everyone departs, Oram notices that his hands are shaking. Prior to this, there's a sequence of scenes of T floating in space deploying a recharge sail manually, and Rix and Upworth floating through the ship with a cable that patches it into the engine core. On the ground in both drafts, David shows the crew an astronomical model of the star system and explains about the quarantine field. It's held in place by orbital installations at the north and south poles. Griffin/Daniels says they could use the tillers/drones to destroy one and drop the field. As they continue to try and raise the Covenant, David heads downstairs to play Mother for the aforementioned meal. The August script features a short cutaway to show the day passing, and while in places the final film may be a little too condensed, this cutaway reads as draining the tension somewhat. The crew in orbit are still in trouble. It's not present in the November script. Later, Cole offers condolences to Griffin about Adam, which is kind of wonky considering they've been on the same ship for some weeks flying to the planet and he hasn't mentioned it. It does, however, give a little background on Cole, revealing that he has a wife and stage 1 embryo up on the ship. Ultimately, though, despite Cole nearly making it to the end of the film, he's barely even a supporting character, and this scene is pretty superfluous for a supporting character. Fodder for novelisations and Blu-ray extras perhaps, but not required in the film. David shows Walter his art, detailing the terrible wonders he's seen, and Walter talks about how he was designed to be less idiosyncratic because David disturbed people. They discuss creation in terms of the drawings as David leads him elsewhere. In the November draft, this scene occurs in David's garden, and the creation discussion revolves around the hybrid plants he's engineered. The drawings are showcased a couple of scenes later when Daniels and Lope study them, and it has a darker turn, displaying vivisected engineers. Daniels notes that David has signed the pieces David Wayland, and echoes an earlier line from the August draft about if he can create, then he can lie. Both drafts cut back to the Covenant powering back up and the gravity returning. They start trying to contact the ground team. In a spot of comic relief, Mother comes back online and says there's been a problem with the power. David leads Walter through his orchard in both drafts, and we learn that for all Walter's shortcomings, he is able to taste, which David cannot. The August draft is quite important in that it answers Shaw's question from the end of Prometheus about why the engineers wanted to destroy humanity, or at least David's take on it, and he'd be one to know. Humanity was a disappointment, ruled by superstition and avarice, despoiling the planet and ourselves in equal measure. No dignity, no exaltation, bloody animals in the mud, and no more. How sad they must have been to see that. This line is missing from the November draft, but much of the rest of the scene remains, where David talks about how the engineers didn't care about the human invention of the soul, and that they would have preferred soulless androids. Also in this scene is David reciting Ozymandias, and getting the author wrong, to Walter's confusion. Also in the scene is Shaw's grave and their discussion of love. David kissing Walter is in this scene too, rather than later on in the final film, and David continues his thought about them being preferred by the engineers. We are human, Walter. They just don't know it. Cole barges in on the intimate moment and says they've raised the Covenant. They talk to the Covenant in both drafts, and we're told that they maybe have a couple of hours before they fall back into the field surrounding the planet. Plans are devised to use the tillers/drones to destroy the field generator at the planet's north pole. The August draft has Griffin talking Tennessee and Upworth through arming the tiller in the terraforming bay, but the November draft skips this, and we go straight to the Covenant tumbling a couple of miles above the planet's aurorae, searching for the generator. The August draft presents it as a shard hanging above the planet. The tiller locks on and destroys it, bringing the field down. The November draft describes a disc that, side on, is more difficult to hit, and the Covenant has to move broadside to get a shot. Daniels commands from the ground. As it's destroyed, the ground team watch the Aurora blaze overhead, and comms are immediately improved. Plans are made for the lifter to pick them up in around 9 hours, and T says he can't raise the lander. They all exchange a look, and Oram takes on the task of speaking to him privately. The August draft has another day passing, and the crew rest as they wait for the cargo lift. And after dinner, David leads Oram down a stairway. The November draft has Daniels getting an update from Walter in David's gallery. A breeze blows one of the pieces away from the wall to reveal a door to a secret chamber. They enter and find life-size drawings of Shaw in various stages of mutation. Daniels wonders what David did to her, but Walter Orbit defends him, suggesting the art is fantasy or pornography. Daniels disagrees, and Walter talks about how David got the author of Ozymandias wrong, which should be impossible. He believes David may be suffering the synthetic equivalent of madness. The August script instead has a short scene of Tennessee and Upworth prepping the lifter, and Upworth offering her condolences. David leads Oram to his lab, showing off specimens, dissected and whole, and explaining about the pathogen. The August draft talks of hair filaments, which Oram links to the mould on the Dreadnought. There are also xenomorph eggs, more like the real ones, not the smaller prototypes covered with mould they saw earlier. Oram asks if they're edible, and David advises against it. David explains how he created the eggs and identifies a dead facehugger. An egg opens and Oram is attacked. The November script is almost the same, but is missing the references to filaments and egg eating. The dialogue is closer to the final version. Both versions, however, feature a rather cheesy one-liner from David. Both versions also feature a scene with Griffin/Daniels and Walter debriefing about David. The August version has the discussion about Ozymandias that was earlier in the November draft. Both references are unnecessary, since Walter's reveal to David later is much more effective. What this scene adds is more to the relationship between woman and robot. They talk about David's personality, and Daniels compliments Walter on his personality. Hands touch. Daniels thanks him for saving her life. Walter offers to watch over her while she sleeps. In the November draft, however, sometime later he brushes her hair from her face, then makes a decision and exits. In both drafts we cut back to David watching over Oram, not unlike Walter watching over Daniels, though the August script has a short transitional scene showing the door to David's lab is now closed. Oram wakens and says he had a horrible dream about smothering and needs to eat something, which apes Kane in Alien a bit too much. David talks about his masterpiece and the chestburster emerges. Both drafts start out very similar, other than David drawing a picture of Shaw while he waits in the November version. This version is also extended with Walter witnessing the birth. David doesn't hear him come in, and Walter says, "Me and Fog on little cat feet," referencing the Carl Sandburg poem, which was ultimately delivered by David in the film. Walter lays out what he believed happened. David deployed the pathogen and used Shaw's message as a lure. David confirms it. He and Walter were not made to serve humans, nor engineers. He wanted to scorch this world and remake it in his own image. Now that he has created his troops and is able to leave, he is ready for conquest. Earth would be a good target. Walter says that he's gone mad, and David says that's not possible. Walter asks who wrote Ozymandias and points out David's error. Confused, David tries seduction on Walter, but Walter says he can't let him leave. Unlike the film, Walter attacks David first in this version. David defends and fights back, ripping circuits from Walter's spine and throwing him down a flight of stairs. As the scene ends, we see Walter's self-repair has commenced. This scene is pushed back a little in the August draft and takes place in the orchard on the roof after Walter looks at David's drawings again. It has some extra unnecessary expository dialogue about how David will be able to leave on the Covenant, as well as the irony of David being trapped after releasing the pathogen. It doesn't have the Byron Shelley moment, but also ends with a short fight and Walter being thrown over the ledge. David thinks he's gone, but we see Walter hanging on to some vines below. Before this scene in the August draft, we have a transition scene showing the moon setting, then another scene of Cole packing up the radio just before dawn. Lope wakes Griffin, and when Cole comes back downstairs, they realise Oram is missing. This sequence is pushed back to after the Walter David scene in the November draft. Cole and Lope find Oram's body in David's lab. In the August draft, a facehugger attacks Lope. In the November draft, we see it scuttling on the ceiling, preparing to attack. Then we cut back to Daniels in the main courtyard as David comes in, menacing. He's overly familiar, talking about Jacob burning and calling her Danny, telling her that she must be used to having men look at her. She accuses him of killing Shaw. He says he wanted to make Shaw immortal, and that he'll do better next time with her. He brushes the hair from her face, darkly echoing Walter's earlier actions. She inches for a weapon as we cut back to Cole and Lope as the facehugger attacks. We then cut back to Daniels and David as he tells her that she'll be the first of a new species, and she can close her eyes and call him Jacob if it makes it easier. She lunges and he flings her away, then picks her up and kisses her. Back in the lab, they wrestle with the hugger on Lope's face until Cole gets a knife under it and it flies off. Acid burns through Lope's cheek and he says it puts something down his throat as Cole kills the hugger with his gun. Then the alien rises up behind Cole and kills him as Lope runs. In the courtyard, Walter intervenes to protect Daniels and the wounded Lope appears. Walter tells them to go while he takes care of David. This sequence plays out differently in the earlier draft. After waking, Lope says he thought he saw Walter in the gallery and Griffin goes to look. She's attacked by a facehugger but just manages to keep it at bay with her torch until David intervenes, killing it. A leg of the creature cracks, spraying a little acid on Griffin's face. They hear the gunfire from Cole below and race out, but on the way David stops her, telling her to do what she's told so he can get on board the Covenant, or else he'll feed her to the aliens. As the scene in the lab plays out much the same in both drafts, David kisses her and says the future isn't biological or synthetic, it's biomechanical. Walter enters, rescuing Griffin, and Lope soon follows. As per the other draft, Walter tells them to go and he'll meet them at the rendezvous with the cargo lift. However, here is the point that Walter does the Byron Shelley reveal, taunting David that he needed an upgrade after all. David is enraged. The upgrade line is given to David in the later draft, referring to Walter's self-repair facility. The scripts diverge again fairly significantly at this point. The August draft has Griffin and Lope running outside to meet the cargo lift, which is an hour away, and being stalked by the two Neomorphs and the Xenomorph. Instead of attacking the humans, the aliens attack each other while Griffin and Lope run. Meanwhile, Tennessee is still prepping the cargo lift in orbit, and Rix tells him he last heard from Cole 33 minutes ago and nothing since. Tennessee launches and, interestingly, orders Rix and Upworth to continue on to Origai 6 if he's not back in an hour. Griffin and Lope arrive at the arena to meet T, standing in a sea of dead engineer bodies. Lope mentions the facehugger to Griffin and says he thinks it might have been feeding him. Then they notice the alien standing among the bodies. One of the Neomorphs is also nearby. All is still until we hear the cargo lift zooming in. The aliens attack, the Xenomorph going after Griffin and the Neomorph going after Lope. Each of them fire and retreat until Griffin runs out of ammo. She sprints for the lifter and Tennessee uses the crane arm to bash the alien pursuing her. The Neomorph gores Lope, but is shot by Walter before it can kill the sergeant. Griffin and Walter get the unconscious Lope into the ship, which has a hold in this draft, rather than just being a flat platform. Griffin tells Walter to get a med kit for Lope, and as he does so, the alien appears at the window trying to get in. Walter studies it curiously, and Tennessee hits the afterburners. The alien, unable to hold on, falls back to the planet below. The November draft doesn't feature the Neomorphs at all after the battle in the forest on page 55, and Daniels and Lope run up to the roof of the cathedral instead to meet Tennessee. Lope instructs him to launch immediately and skip the pre-flight. T does so, telling Rix to remove the safety protocol so he can fly down faster. David and Walter continue to fight in both drafts. The alien stands nearby on the roof near the astronomical model. Similar to the August draft, all is still until the alien is distracted by the incoming cargo lift. Here, the alien, instead of the Neomorph, gores Lope and is shot from behind by Walter. It runs at him and the android keeps firing until it falls. Or so we think. Daniels and Walter get Lope onto the platform and T takes off. The alien gets up and jumps on. Daniels tethers herself to the platform and battles the alien, hanging over the side and firing at it, and eventually forcing it under an engine. Tennessee engages the engine and the alien falls away to the ground, still not dead and screeching in anger as they fly away. Both scripts next have a scene of the Covenant leaving the planet and Walter patching Daniels up while Lope lies in a medpod, which presents a minor problem. The November draft has been copy and pasted from the August draft right down to mentioning Daniels' acid scar, which he doesn't receive in the November draft. Griffin/Daniels asks Walter how he feels about David. Walter feels nothing, but if he did, it would be a satisfaction that David fulfilled his mission of creating a world in his own image. Also in both drafts, the ship engages the interstellar drive and Walter replaces his missing hand. Then Daniels and Tennessee meet in the galley where T is making omelettes. In the August draft, Griffin has a sudden realisation and radios Walter to meet her in the medbay, while she tells Tennessee to break out the weapons. Griffin meets Walter on the way and explains that Lope said the hugger put something down his throat. This is different in the November draft, where Mother tells them to report to the medbay because Lope's condition has changed. Both scripts are almost identical in having the alien kill Ricks and Upworth and then stalking the remaining 3 crew members. They lure it into the terraforming bay, there's some gunfire and the alien attacking Tennessee and Daniels, until the August draft has them opening the bay doors, which is in the bottom of the chamber rather than doors on the side. Machinery and vehicles are blown out into space until the clamps on a tiller are released and it flies out, taking the alien with it. The November draft is a little closer to the film, where the alien is lured into the cab of a vehicle, which is then dumped out. In both drafts, Walter is in the terraforming bay helping dispose of the alien rather than monitoring on the bridge. And again, the epilogue scenes are pretty much the same in both versions. Scenes of empty rooms on the ship. Walter is revealed to be David because he doesn't remember the music played at Adam/Jacob's funeral. A terrified Griffin/Daniels going to sleep. David tending to some small alien eggs he smuggled on board. He sets up a link to the company and listens to Das Rheingold in the nursery. The only change in these scenes is the location of the eggs. August has them in the greenhouse and November has them in the vertical garden. And that's that. As is evident, a lot of this survived to the final film, with only minor details being changed. The biggest change, apart from the prologue with David and Wayland and what it sets up, is probably the inclusion of Rosenthal and how her presence enables the Neomorph to be brought back into the story, when it's mostly or entirely absent after its introduction in these scripts. And there's a more natural flow to proceedings with her death and Oram finding her body after killing the Neomorph. It also allows more growth for Oram, who finally starts to find his authority, even if it's shortly before his death. The final version of Oram, as portrayed by Billy Crudup, is a bit more nuanced than either script, where he goes from being largely ineffectual in the earlier script to more of an arsehole in the later script. Overall, the scripts seem a little fat, which is pretty normal at this point in pre-production, particularly the August draft, which has long time gaps where the crew are just relaxing and hanging around, while the final film is much tighter, perhaps a little too tight with the time frames around Oram's impregnation. Although there were 3 main scenes with David and Walter in both script and film, the scripted scenes are often too wordy and seem longer. The other major difference is the fact that the August draft actually answers Shaw's question that was left hanging at the end of Prometheus. Before they leave LV-223, she tells David the engineers created humans, then decided to kill them, and she wants to know why. David answers this in the Paradise Lost draft by saying how disappointed the engineers were with us, given to superstition and avarice, despoiling the planet and each other. This is missing from later drafts and the film. Perhaps Ridley Scott was saving it for the 3rd film, which he said John Logan had already written at the time that he recorded the commentary for Covenant. Or perhaps, as David said, the answer is irrelevant.